Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Today's Lunch and Learn is entitled HIFIS 4. Are you ready? My name is Pam Jones, and I'm the Manager of Knowledge Mobilization at End Homelessness St. John's. And just before we get started, we respectfully acknowledge the province of Newfoundland and Labrador, of which the city of St. John's is the capital city, as the ancestral homelands of the Beothuk. Today, these lands are home to a diverse population of Indigenous and other peoples. We would also like to acknowledge with respect the diverse histories and cultures of the Mi'kmaq, Innu, Inuit, and Southern Inuit of this province. Okay, so what we'll cover today around HIFIS 4, we'll first give a little introduction to End Homelessness St. John's, Reaching Home and HIFIS. What is HIFIS 4? We'll look at service providers and clusters. We'll look at the differences between client information and provider information, look at staff roles and user rights, the legal framework around HIFIS 4, and we'll give you an update of HIFIS implementation to date. We'll give you some information to get you ready for HIFIS 4 when it comes to your agency. And then at the end, we'll have some time for some questions and answers. Okay, Reaching Home is a Government of Canada's funding initiative to end homelessness. Reaching Home requires all designated communities, of which St. John's is one, and End Homelessness St. John's is the community entity. It requires us to have a homeless management information system. And if a designated community does not have an existing system, we're required to implement HIFIS. So that's one of the directives under Reaching Home. A couple of weeks ago, you had a presentation on coordinated access to homes, and HIFIS is really to support that. And it ensures that the right information is collected to support the coordination of access to homes. So they really work hand in hand. So that's what we have to think about as we go forward with the implementation of HIFIS. There are a few housekeeping notes to take into account. The session is being recorded. Everyone is muted at the moment. Feel free to use the chat function for comments and the question and answer function for questions, and we'll address them in the Q&A session at the end. Just to make a note that the chat and the Q&A can be anonymous if you so desire. So just a little background on End Homelessness St. John's. At EHSJ, we work toward a vision in which every resident of St. John's has a place to call home. The idea of ending homelessness seems daunting at times, but we appreciate a challenge. We choose the tagline, "We can end it because we believe we can." We love the idea of systems change to ensure better outcomes for all our neighbors, and even if it means working ourselves out of a job, and that is true. What is HIFIS? So everyone's heard a lot about HIFIS in the community. HIFIS stands for the Homeless Individuals and Families Information System. It was developed by Employment and Social Development Canada, also known as ESDC. And that the development was done in collaboration with communities all across Canada. There are earlier versions of HIFIS, like 3.8. Some of you may be familiar with that version. They were installed on standalone computers within many of the homeless serving agencies. But because they were on standalone computers, they didn't support collaboration across the community. It was just kind of collaboration within the agency itself. How HIFIS 4 is different is that it's web-based. So it allows multiple service providers to access real-time data and refer clients to appropriate services. And because it's web-based, it can use any web-enabled device, such as laptops or smartphones or tablets. So kind of to remove the mystery around HIFIS, I just want to give you a peek under the hood. This is what the login screen looks like. You can see you'll have a username, a password, and a service provider. So the service provider would be essentially your agency within the homeless serving community. And once you've logged in, you'll come to a welcome screen where you will see numerous tabs across the top. And the first thing you'll see is whether there are any bulletins, any communication that you need to be aware of on that day when you sign in. So the tabs are, there's a front desk tab, a communications tab, there's a point in time count tab, reports. So there can be custom reports for either the whole community or your organization. The administration tab, that's where myself and anyone who's working directly with me, that we hang out there most. Help tab is kind of self-explanatory. That's where you'd search for any help within the system, or change your password, that sort of thing, get that kind of information. My account is just all the information about your account, like in any other application, and you just go there to log out and so on. When you do log in, you'll see right now this is just a demo organization, but when you log in with your own credentials, you would see the name of your own organization there, and then the client search. If you were going to serve a client, you would search for their name here first, just to see if they're already in the system. The front desk tab is pretty much where people will spend most of their time. There are 19 modules here, and people will be given access to those modules based on the information that they need to enter or need to access as part of their work in the system. So not all users will have carte blanche access to all of these modules. It'll be really restricted according to people's roles. Clusters is another term that when working with HIFIS you become very familiar with. The plan in St. John's is to have a single instance of HIFIS 4, but there are different options for how HIFIS can be configured within that instance. So the clusters are different types. There's integrated, partially clustered, or isolated. An integrated cluster is where you have multiple service providers all within the same cluster. And that means that these, in cluster A, for instance, service provider 1, 2, and 3 can all share information back and forth, depending on, privacy levels and access levels that are granted to the different users. Partially clustered, you have a case where you would have cluster A, which would have multiple service providers, and then a cluster B, which would just have a single service provider off on its own. And in this case, the service providers under cluster A can all talk to one another, but they have no communication with cluster B. So there would not be able to be any data sharing or information sharing of any kind between those two clusters. The isolated cluster, you have completely separate clusters. So a single service provider is in each cluster. And to set HIFIS up in that way is really not an improvement over 3.8, because it really operates the same as a standalone system. You wouldn't be able to share information back and forth across service providers. User rights. So there's really a really strict setup before implementing HIFIS on how people can access the information that's contained therein. For instance, you have a series of permissions or user rights that governs what portions of HIFIS they can access. So referring back to those modules, and those are really role-based. So someone who's a shelter worker versus a case manager, for instance, would have a different level of access to HIFIS. And user rights are then organized into rights templates. So if you think then again about the different modules and the different clusters, the rights templates would give similar roles across organizations to similar rights. So a shelter worker in one agency would have similar rights to a shelter worker in another agency. And that's just kind of a management and administration kind of necessity, because you wouldn't want to have, hundreds of different kinds of access going on. There are different kinds of user rights. The main ones being listing records, displaying records, adding records, editing records, and deleting records. And all of those rights are assigned individually to each user that has access to HIFIS. So that's all set up ahead of implementation. Client information versus service information. So client information includes things like the demographic information that would be shared across all service providers in a cluster. Demographics obviously are things like name, date of birth, gender, and then added to that would be some more information about financial information, housing history, contact information, and so on. This is kind of the information that would be collected during the initial intake process, for instance. And there's a note at the bottom about there's the ability to manually restrict the sharing of certain items. So for instance, if a client went into a particular shelter, for instance, and there were some sensitivities around housing history or financial information or something, that could be kind of protected in the back end so that other people couldn't see it. But that's the default, is that anyone within that cluster would be able to see the information that's entered at intake. Service information, on the other hand, it kind of, and I'm using air quotes, belongs to the service provider. So this is like all the activities and services that are performed by a service provider. So that's like more information about the details of their admission or case management, if there's an incident in a shelter or other facility, if there information around their housing placements, turnaways, and any goods and services they might receive. So again, this is viewable only by staff at the service provider, but that's the default. But if an individual or two caseworkers needed to work together on something, there are ways of sharing information case by case, but the default is that it's not shared across service providers. Kind of the reason for doing this, so if you enter all the client information, it only needs to be entered once. That makes it, less traumatic for the client to have to share information over and over again. It reduces the workload for the people who are doing the intake and providing of services, and it allows for faster connection with service because you don't have to recollect and re-enter all that information that's associated with the client. The legal framework around HIFIS 4 is pretty rigorous. The first step is a data provision agreement, which kind of gives our community the permission to use HIFIS. And we have in Homelessness St. John's have signed that agreement with ESDC that I referred to earlier at Reaching Home. A data sharing agreement, when different agencies are sharing data back and forth, we need to have, so it's like kind of a guideline and agreement as to what that looks like, how that information is shared, how we protect privacy and confidentiality of clients, and so on. And in some cases, not all communities, but we do have one, is a privacy impact assessment, which really looks at the risks associated with our setup in our community. Consent form, obvious. This is where the client consents to the collection and then use of their information to find them homes. We have a kind of a drafted and approved version of that. That's just about ready to go. And then there's the end user license agreement. And that's kind of standard to any kind of application that you would download off the internet. Like before you use it, you have to read the conditions and so on, and then kind of just accept that before you'll be given access to the application itself. There are other optional agreements, service level agreement, oath of confidentiality, user protocols, and kind of rules of behavior. Like we might not in this community go with all four of these as they're written, but we will definitely have some sort of agreement around confidentiality for those end users that are collecting and sharing data in HIFIS. And we'll have some protocols around the quality of data and so on. But they might not necessarily have the names of these things, but we will definitely be following some of the guidelines that are projected in these types of legal agreements. Okay, just to give you an update of where we are right now in St. John's with the implementation of HIFIS. Like any application implementation, we're going to be following a system development cycle. So really starting over here with planning, and that started here in January, really. And this part is about determining the project scope and phasing, assembling your project team, and beginning to draft those legal documents that are required. The analysis involves looking at local staff roles, determining required user rights, identifying required business functions, and so on. And I've only got 3 examples for each, but there's a long list of steps that are involved in each of these parts of the cycle. Design, that's where those rights templates are created. And this is where you determine which modules will be used, which of those 19 modules. And we'll agree on community-wide business processes, like how we share information, who sees what, and so on. We'll need to agree on that as a community. The development phase, this is where the programs themselves are configured in HIFIS, configure lookup tables, develop data dictionaries, and so on. So this is the point where, HIFIS is used by multiple agencies across the country who do similar work that we do here in St. John's. But we have the ability to configure it a little bit to our needs. And of course, we have different roles, different kinds of setups than in other parts of the country. So we'll really need to customize it for our own community. So that's where that development part comes in. And then, of course, there's testing. So once we've done all that requirements gathering piece, we'll create some accounts, create some dummy data, and then conduct user acceptance training. So this is where we just check out if, based on how we have things set up, that it's really going to work when we go live. And then we come down to the actual implementation. So this is where this is all happening in a sandbox, in a test environment. And then what we'll do is move from the test environment over into a production environment. And then we'll make that change over. And then we go live. You have to go through all these steps before you can actually flip the switch and go live. And then the maintenance, of course, it doesn't end once HIFIS is implemented. From that point forward, we'll have to set up ongoing IT support, set up a local help desk, and plan for ongoing training and so on. So the work really continues. It really is a cycle, and we'll need to go through the different kinds of agencies and so on, and really repeat all of these steps for the different phases of our work. We're doing this in a kind of a phased implementation, and we're aiming, fingers crossed, aiming to have all organizations associated with coordinated access to homes, to have all those on board by the end of this fiscal year, so by the end of March 2022. The phases at the moment, as they stand at the moment, phase 1 is just 2 emergency shelters. We're piloting, going through all those phases with the gathering place and connections for seniors, like looking at the different roles, the different requirements, different functions within HIFIS that will be required and so on. And that work will then inform bringing on all the other emergency shelters. So the remaining emergency shelters in St. John's. And emergency shelters are the first phase, because that's normally the first point of entry for someone who's homeless. So that's why we're starting there. And then this phase 3+, I've called it, that's the other homeless serving agencies. And so we'll bring those on in order of priority, as they're according to the ones that are really required for coordinated access to homes. And it'll be based on different agencies' readiness to participate. The timeline down here, phase 1. So we're already in that. So that's Q1 of 2021-22. So right now so Q1 is April to June of this year. So we're in that right now, and kind of in the development phase, moving toward testing. So it's well underway. Phase 2 will begin soon after that with the other shelters. So that'll be July to September. And then after that, in October, right through to March, we'll apply what we've learned in phase 1, phase 2, and bring all those other agencies on board. So the kinds of agencies that would be involved in phase 3 would be like direct housing providers, direct housing support providers, and then some of those secondary supports like furniture banks and possibly food banks and those sorts of agencies. I should point out that, like, I think like the lines between the quarters are kind of fuzzy because, you know, phase 1 may spill a bit over into phase 2. We may need to start phase 2 a little bit early to start that requirements gathering. So we're ready to really do the work in Q2, and the same for Q3. So the lines are fuzzy, but these are the kind of the timeline boxes that we're working toward to get the work done by the end of March. So what do we have to do to get ready for HIFIS? So that first part that I keep referring to, the requirements gathering. So we'll need to talk to each and every agency, homeless serving agency in St. John's. First and foremost is the commitment of the service provider to use HIFIS. It's very important to have that initial, interest in participating. We'll need to do an inventory of the programs and services associated with each of those agencies. Look at the roles and responsibilities of staff who will be using HIFIS there. Required user rights for each staff role. So who's going to have access to what in each agency, and the business functions for staff roles in HIFIS. And that in turn determines which modules each of those staff people will have access to. On top of that, there's some technical requirements. I don't imagine that anyone's using dial-up at the moment, or at least I hope not, but we'll have to do things like make sure the network connection is sufficient to process HIFIS transactions. We will need to know, how many things might be happening at one time to make sure that the network can handle it. We'll need to ensure that the service provider staff have the appropriate technical skills. We don't need highly skilled computer users, but people have to really know their way around a computer a little bit to work with HIFIS. So that doesn't mean that it excludes you from implementation. It just means that we need a little upfront work before it's going to work. We need to know that service providers have the appropriate workstations to support the right number of users. So if you have 10 users and one computer, it might get a little hard to keep the information up to date and that sort of thing. And we need to understand that you have an appropriate and updated version of a browser installed on all workstations. So it could be, I don't know, Safari, Chrome, Edge, different versions, but when the implementation happens, we'll just need to make sure that everyone's using the most up-to-date versions that coincide with the version of HIFIS that we're going to be using. Okay. While you're waiting for your implementation to start, there are a few things online that you could, kind of get your feet wet if you were interested. HIFIS for demo site. That's I did those screenshots from that demo site. That's at Reaching Home at this address shown here. And then there's Acre Consulting. Ali Ryder is kind of the HIFIS guru for the country, and she's got some excellent learning materials on her website. with like lots of training materials. And this Getting Started with HIFIS is like a 5-lesson course that's free to people who want to sign up and take that. So if you're interested in getting your feet wet before the implementation gets to you, then feel free to go and check those out. Okay, so that's all the material I've prepared. So we can take some questions now if you have any. And I've asked Matt, who's there in the background, helping me to make sure I see people's questions as they come in, if I happen to miss them. I can't imagine that it was so comprehensive that you don't have any questions. So fire away.
So you see that first question there,
Yep,
Pam?
I see. It was in the chat. That was kind of hidden on my screen.
Yep.
And one came through in the chat, Matt. So would it be beneficial to use HIFIS if we were the sole organization in the community who was doing so? I'm trying to think of a case. I mean, it would be beneficial as a way. It is definitely a good way to organize your information and organize your client information and get a picture of things over time. But the benefit of HIFIS is that ability to communicate across the community. So, you know, it's not that you would rule it out if you're the only one in your community, but definitely is a bigger benefit to be a part of a larger group. Get another question here. Do we know when and how you will be bringing the community together to discuss consents and how we will work together? The consent form that we've developed is kind of part of the broader coordinated access to homes process, and all the processes that we're kind of touching at End Homelessness St. John. So we've developed a consent form and had a legal review that would allow us to use it for multiple purposes. So like we have multiple programs. So we're hoping that that consent form will serve as a single consent form for entry into any of these programs and services. So that'll need to be tested, of course, but we're just about ready to start to roll that one out to people.
Pam, there's a question from Katie. What happens when a person does not consent to a single agency but is okay with overall HIFIS?
Does not consent to a single agency? Well, if you entered someone, if they came through a particular shelter, and that is one of the first questions. So you have different consent options. So they've given explicit consent, in which case you can share all their information, but they can specify to you that, I don't know, an example, there may be a case where they absolutely do not want to share with a certain provider or so on. That's one of those cases where you can kind of override the default and make that information kind of hide it if the person's not comfortable sharing it. So it depends on the kind of consent that they've given. Okay, so we have. My screen is.
I'll get you.
I'm just going to need to make my window bigger here so I can see them.
I can read them out to you, Pam.
Okay, great.
So, hi, Pam. I'm not sure if you would have the answer, but we at the Corner Brook Status of Women used to have access, but have not been able to find a contact to reestablish our access since our last person moved into our housing coordinator role. Any idea who we would contact or if the old system is even still being supported?
The old system, so I happen to know that the Housing and Homeless Network have just hired a person to support HIFIS 3.8. So we can get you some contact information for that person. I know she signed up for this webinar, so she might be there in the background. So we can get her to connect with you.
There's one in the Q&A as well, Pam. This one's from Justin. I've used the HIFIS 4.0 demo site to learn a bit about the program, but have noticed that there are many training modules which are unavailable / under development still. Are you able to speak at all to when we might expect to see a more fulsome training module released?
I'm not sure which ones aren't working. There are different ones that are under development, like the coordinated access to homes, the pit count module is under development. There are different ones, but it's always evolving. Like sometimes they don't release the training until that version of HIFIS is actually updated out in the community. So it's always changing. So it's just kind of a stay tuned, I guess, but I can definitely check that out to see when that would happen.
Just update as well that the contact information is there in the chat now.
Okay, perfect. Thanks, Megan. Okay, those are some good questions. I just want to say that anyone can feel free, if you're not comfortable asking a question or can't get the hang of the anonymous part there, just feel free to reach out with questions at any time after we're done today. And if I don't know the answer, I'll be happy to find it out for you. Okay. I'll just go through to the next spot here. We've got our contact information there. If anyone wanted to look for information there, or you just go to our website and you can find all of us there on the front page. Okay. Thanks very much, everybody. Have a good rest of your day. It's a sunny day in St. John's, so get out and enjoy it. Thank you.